Okay, hello. So, to wake you up after lunch, everybody stand up. Okay, thank you. So, sit down if everything you do is always perfect. Sit down if, whenever you spot an improvement at work that you could make, you do make it. Okay? Sit down if you're a software engineer and when you spot an improvement that you could make to your code, you do make it, always. Okay? I'm expecting most of you to still be on your feet. Really, I just wanted to wake you up. Sit down if you wish you improved things more than you do. Okay, anybody left can sit down. So the point is that most software engineers wish they refactored their code more often. And most people, you know, even if we have people in the room who are not software engineers, most people wish that they made improvements to their work more often than they do. So the big question is, why don't they? Oh, wow. Okay. My slides have been translated into Swedish. I've borrowed a Swedish laptop, and now my slides are in Swedish. My slide notes are in Swedish. And I don't speak Swedish. So, oh no, it was just one bit. Okay, never mind, right. Oh, I see, I get it. So sometimes there's like a default prompt that comes up in the slide notes if there are no slide notes. I'm guessing it said something like, no slide notes here, but in Swedish. But it's fine. My notes are in English, so we can carry on. So I'm going to talk about refactoring. I'm going to talk about what it is. I'm going to talk about what it isn't. I'm going to talk about why it's desirable. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to do it. But then I'm going to talk about why doesn't it happen? And I'm going to talk about how to make it happen. And spoiler, I think compassion is a really big factor in how we can make refactoring happen more often. I think compassion is our secret weapon. So very briefly, I'm going to describe what refactoring is. This is Martin Fowler's definition. When we're refactoring code, what we are doing is we're making that code easier to understand and cheaper to modify. So we're not changing its behavior. And that's really important. We want the code to be easier to understand. We want it to fit in our heads. We want to reduce the cognitive load that we face as software engineers. But we also want it to be cheaper to modify. We want it to be easier to add new functionality. And this is often why we refactor, because we want to add new functionality. But the code is actually hard to modify. It's hard to add new stuff. So first of all, we refactor to make it easier. But what isn't refactoring? So a lot of the time people say refactoring when what they actually mean is a rewrite. Rewriting the whole code base from scratch. That's not refactoring. That is a complete rewrite of the code. Often people talk about refactoring, what they mean is performance gains. Performance gains are really important. If your code is not performant, then you want to improve its performance, but that's not refactoring. Another thing that people think about is improving user experience. Also really important, but not refactoring. When you're refactoring, you're not changing the functionality at all. You're just making it easier to understand and cheaper to modify. Adding new features is not refactoring. That's new code. So you're not making existing code better, you're adding new code. And bug fixing is also not refactoring. Because when you fix a bug, you change the functionality. You make it work instead of not work. But that's not the same thing as refactoring. So why is refactoring desirable? Oh, Oh, sorry, I've just realised something else as well. Doesn't matter, it's fine. Because we had a bit of an issue, we are now using an older version of my slides, not the one that I changed an hour ago. But that's also fine. We refactor because it's satisfying, because it feels good to make our code easier to understand and cheaper to modify. But we also do it because we want to improve the quality. So we want better quality code. We want our teams to be able to perform as effectively as possible. And our teams can perform effectively when the code is easy to understand and cheap to modify. But that in itself is satisfying. So I'm going to talk about how to refactor later on in the talk. No, I'm not. I'm going to do it now because these aren't the edited slides. How do you refactor? Okay, so refactoring, first of all, is part of the TDD cycle. So if you practice test-driven development, then you are ideally refactoring all the time. That you're writing very small tests and you're making those tests pass. And if you're doing it really well, you're doing that several times an hour. And every time you make a test pass, your next job is to refactor. And you're refactoring a tiny amount of code, just a little bit of code that's made one very atomic test pass. But you're constantly refactoring. It's part of your workflow that every piece of code you write gets refactored. But you might also be refactoring because you're about to do something. So just before you start a piece of work, you refactor to make the code easy to understand and cheap to modify. Useful refactoring principles. The top one is absolutely my favorite, really important, and it's the one that possibly people most often miss or don't know how to do. That's refactoring in small chunks. And when I say small, I mean really small. So in the same way as when you've just written a new piece of code and it might only be a couple of lines of code, your next job is to refactor it to make it easy to understand and cheap to modify. When you're refactoring a piece of code that you haven't touched for a while, you can do it in tiny, tiny chunks. You can make a tiny change and then run the test to make sure that they still pass. But you can't do that unless you've made your code testable first. So before you refactor, you want to make sure that you've got a really good test suite in place so that you can keep running those tests while you're refactoring and make sure you haven't broken anything. You want to make sure those tests stay green. So if, as a result of the refactor that you've just done, a bunch of tests fail, you have not finished that refactor. At the end of every very small refactoring change, you make the test pass. It's really, really important because you need confidence that you haven't changed the functionality and you haven't broken anything. If your tests were passing and now they're failing, you've changed the functionality, and that isn't your goal when you're refactoring. And then there's the thing about which bits do I refactor. And we may well, a lot of us, if not all of us, have had the experience of looking at code and going, this bit's been bothering me for ages. And I hated it when I wrote it, and I've been wanting to refactor it for ages. And I'm going to leap on it the first chance I get. And not paying attention to the fact that nobody ever touches that code. Maybe it's not even executing very often, if at all. So the code that you want to refactor should be the code that is touched more often and has most impact on the working system. So what is the code that gets seen most often, touched most often by developers? That's the code that you need to prioritize when you're refactoring. But refactoring often doesn't happen. So things get in the way. This is my son Oscar trying to do some really fancy gymnastics and being blocked. And look at his poor head at the end there. It's like, oh, I was going to show you something really cool. Okay, so what gets in the way of refactoring? There are a few things that get in the way of refactoring. The most obvious one is external pressure. So people are saying to you, you haven't got time. We've got deadlines to meet. We're busy. It'll slow you down. So we don't do refactoring because we're in a rush. Now, sometimes we're in a rush because other people are putting us in a rush. Sometimes we're in a rush because we're impatient and we're like eager to move on to the next thing and like, I don't have time. Sometimes we don't refactor because we're seeking perfection. I will explain that one if it doesn't, because it might not be obvious what I mean. Sometimes we don't refactor because we don't believe we can. And in all of those, the thing that gets in the way, I think, is a lack of compassion. So let's start by looking at external pressure. So this is the idea that somebody's giving you deadlines, they're in a rush, they're saying you haven't got time, and you feel like, no, can't do it. That's one of the blockers. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to describe the blockers first before I describe possible solutions to those blockers. So external pressure is one. And then there's internal pressure. You're in a rush. And this is me. I am an impatient person. I hold my hands up just because I speak at conferences and I'm a technical coach and I help people to improve their software development practices. And I explicitly teach refactoring as a skill all the time. I'm not perfect. I'm an impatient person. I have ADHD, which is probably relevant, but I sometimes am in a rush and I just kind of go steaming forward, even though I know that I should pause, slow down, and make things better. So if I do that, then I'm guessing, well, I know other people do it too. So what about seeking perfection? Now, this might sound counterintuitive, but what happens is we think our code should be perfect. We think everything should be beautiful and wonderful and brilliant, particularly when we go to conferences and listen to speakers telling us all these things about how to make our code brilliant. And we think, oh, I should be like that. I should always do everything perfectly. But none of us do. And you might come to a conference and hear about loads of great techniques and go home like full of, yes, I'm going to do it all right. From now on, I'm going to do everything right. I'm going to do it by the book. And then you don't. And then feel a bit rubbish. And you think, yeah, I'm no good at this. I'm never going to be able to make it perfect. Therefore, I don't even want to think about it. I don't want to look at it. I don't want to be confronted with how bad my code is. So I'm just going to not think about it because I think it should be perfect. And of course it isn't. And that makes me feel bad. That's demoralizing. It leads to guilt, shame, and despair. And none of those emotions are very motivational. None of them actually help us to do things. They stop us from doing things. So that belief that it should be perfect can actually stop us from making it better. And then we come a cropper. So this is my son Oscar again. Again, look at his face at the very end. Like, oh my God. But, I mean, take a moment to admire his amazing falling over technique. Okay, so yeah, another problem that we have is that we don't believe we can do it. So it's quite a common one here is that particularly people who are junior or people who are new to a team, new to a code base, or just new to a particular area of the code base, they look at it and they go, well, I've no idea what's going on here. I don't really understand it, so I'm not going to try and refactor it because I'll probably break things. And probably whoever wrote this, they probably knew what they were doing. And the problem is not the code, the problem is me. I'm just a bit stupid. I don't really understand it. So I'm definitely not going to try and refactor it because I'm not clever enough. Okay, so the ducks. One of the times, I think one of the first times I did this talk, I had written cue cards to help me know what to say next. And before I revealed this slide, I saw the word duck written on the cue card telling me that this slide was coming up, but I'd forgotten that I'd put a picture of a duck. And there was a minute I was like, duck. Like, almost like I travelled to the future and sent a message back to myself that something was about to come and hit me in the head. But no, that's not why the cue card said duck. It said duck because there's a picture of a duck. And the reason there's a picture of a duck is because at that particular conference, Holly Cummins, which I think she's here as well, had done a talk about the importance of fun in the workplace. And what she said is that it's been scientifically proven that ducks are the funniest animal. So this was just me injecting a bit of fun. So no spears, no spikes. What do I mean by that? Before I tell you, okay, I don't know if this is going to work. Let's see, because I forgot to set up. Okay, so you might not have heard that, but my laptop that's my son again. And he was saying, run, jump, run, jump, run, jump, no spears, no spikes. And that was because we had asked him what he did at his school sports day, and he said he did an obstacle race, and we got a bit carried away, and we said, was it like Indiana Jones, and were there spikes and spears and things that got in your way? And he was like, no, just had to run, jump, run, jump, run, jump, no spears, no spikes. So the reason, oh, there you go. Okay, so the reason that's there is to say that actually it's not as hard as you think, and the repercussions are not what you think if you do refactoring well. So I'll talk a bit more about that later, but there are no spears and no spikes. You can refactor safely even when you don't understand the code that you are refactoring. In fact, if we go back to our definition of refactoring, we're making the code easier to understand. And in order to understand code, one of the things you can do is refactor it to better understand it. And you can do that when you start from a position of not understanding it. And I will talk a little bit more about that later. But the main point of this talk is that I'm saying the thing that gets in the way of refactoring is a lack of compassion. So what's compassion got to do with it? Well, I want to talk about how we can create the conditions where refactoring is facilitated and encouraged and made more likely. And I think that in all of the things that we have to do to improve those conditions, showing compassion is vital. So this is both of my sons. That's my eldest son, Felix, on the left, making sure Oscar doesn't fall over again. And we can help each other, stop each other from falling over by showing each other compassion. So what we can do is use compassion to mitigate the problem of external pressure. We can use compassion to balance the impatience. We can use compassion to embrace imperfection, to believe in ourselves, and to seek joy. So let's talk about that first one, the external pressure, the deadlines that prevent us from refactoring because we don't believe we have time. The thing is that there is never any end to those to-do lists. There are always more things that need to be done. So it's very tempting to think that when I get to the end of this to-do list, when I get to the end of these things that urgently need doing, then I'll do the refactoring. But you're never going to get to the end. There's always going to be more stuff that needs doing. There's always going to be more deadlines on the way. And the longer you leave it, the more refactoring there is to do, the harder it is to do it, the less likely that you'll do it. So what you need is to show each other compassion. And you also need the people who are setting those deadlines to be able to show you compassion. So instead of saying, we'll have all of these things done by this date and then we'll do the refactoring, what you have to do is say, we'll tackle one thing at a time and each thing will involve refactoring. So everything we do has refactoring built into it. But in order to do that, you do need people to show you compassion. You need to ask for compassion. You need to say, listen, this is not helping us, this constant demand to meet deadlines, this constant demand to move quickly. We need to be shown compassion. We need to show each other compassion and recognize that we need a less pressured environment in order to feel the confidence to do refactoring. And we will get done whatever we get done. And the thing is that deadlines don't make you do more stuff. They make you panic more about doing more stuff, but they don't actually help you to get more stuff done. The stuff that needs doing is still going to need doing, whether the deadline is there or not. The only thing that might change is that you might end up working in such a pressured environment that you burn out. So yes, you might work more quickly for a period of time, but eventually you're going to burn out and then you're going to move more slowly. And the same applies with technical debt and unrefactored code, that the more it builds up, the more it slows you down and the higher price you pay. It's actually more efficient to move slightly more slowly because you have fewer bugs and you have to spend less time fixing the bugs. And refactoring is easier when you do it in small chunks and when you do it as you go, rather than storing it up in a big chunk. And thinking takes time. We are not on a production line building physical objects. We are knowledge workers. We have to think in order to write code. We're not just churning it out. And interestingly, there's been a bunch of studies. The majority of time spent writing code is not spent typing on a keyboard. The majority of time spent writing code is spent thinking about it and talking about it, not literally writing it. That's a really small proportion of the time. So this idea that you can move faster, like type faster, well, that's not actually the important bit. The important bit is thinking, and you can't make people think faster. If you try to make people think faster, it tends to make them panic, and the thinking tends to be less effective. Thinking takes time. But in order for us to take time to think, we have to show each other compassion. We have to understand that we need that time to think. So what about our own impatience? You know, never mind other people saying, there's a deadline, there's a deadline, there's a deadline. What about when we're doing it to ourselves and saying, oh, I'm in a rush, I can't be bothered, I want to do that. Again, in order to get over that, you have to show yourself compassion. You have to, and that's not just about showing yourself the compassion to forgive yourself and give yourself permission to move slowly. It's also about forgiving yourself when you don't. And that's a similar thing to the thing about perfection. If you are an impatient person who sometimes cuts corners and sometimes doesn't refactor when you know you should, then you're going to reach a point where you have code that is not as well factored as it could be. If you are in the habit of beating yourself with a big stick, at that point, you're going to tell yourself off, and you're probably going to be really mean to yourself. If you're anything like me, you're much meaner to yourself than you ever would be to anybody else. So you're going to start telling yourself what a terrible person you are, how useless you are at your job, and that does not motivate you to go back and revisit that code. Because again, that code is a reminder of what a terrible person you are. So you have to be able to show yourself compassion so that you can then stop and say, okay, I'm going to do some refactoring because I'm not a terrible person. I'm just sometimes a bit impatient, and that's okay because now I'm going to slow down and forgive myself and do something about it. So what about this drive to perfection? I mean, you're not going to go back to work and suddenly do everything perfectly. Sorry. That's not going to happen. And if you think it is, then you're setting yourself up for a fall. And it's very easy for me up here on a stage to say that. There is a temptation to think that all of the things that people say when they're delivering talks are said by people who always follow their own advice and always do everything perfectly. And what you're supposed to do is emulate the people who are standing in front of you, and you're supposed to be as amazing as them. But none of them are perfect. And actually, if you pay attention to what the experts say, so this is Ron Jeffries, and I actually asked him before I did one of the iterations of this talk, I said, do you ever follow practices that you discourage in others? Or do you ever miss out steps that you encourage other people to take? And he said, there are things that I think are good but don't always do. And there are things that I think are not so good that I do sometimes do. So none of us are perfect. So what does it mean to embrace imperfection? Well, I happen to be a novelist as well as a technical coach. And I often talk about what I call the hunk of rock. So writer's block is a real problem that a lot of writers face, that it's very difficult to get started. Or you might have got started, but it's very difficult to get moving again after a break. And one of the big factors in writer's block is that you think that what you're going to write is going to be shit. So you don't want to write anything because it's going to be awful, and then you're going to be embarrassed and ashamed. So it's easy to just not write anything at all. And that's a real blocker. It makes it really hard. People are like, I don't want to write something because I know it's going to be awful. But actually, when you're a writer and also when you're a software engineer, what you don't have that some other creative people have is raw material. So if you're a sculptor, you start with a hunk of rock or whatever your material is that you're sculpting. It starts just an ugly lump, and then you sculpt it and you turn it into something beautiful. You've got the raw material that you gradually make beautiful. As writers and software engineers, there is no raw material. We have to make the raw material. So in the context of writing, I talk about the hunk of rock as being the first draft, and it's going to be ugly. But you need raw material, and you have to make your own raw material. So you have to embrace the fact that your first draft will be rubbish. You have to give yourself permission to create something terrible in order to make it beautiful. And that's this idea of embracing imperfection. Your job for that first draft is to create something terrible. And then you get the satisfaction of turning it into something good. And all writers do this. All successful writers, published writers, they edit what they create, and their first drafts are not good. And the same can apply to coding. The very first, so particularly if you're doing the test-driven development, red, green, refactor, the first code, the first thing is a test that fails. The next thing is code that makes the test pass, but that's all it does. It just makes the test pass. It's not necessarily good code. That's why the next step is refactor. So before you get to the refactoring, you create the hunk of rock, you create the raw material, the ugly code, and then you can make it beautiful. And that's about embracing imperfection, not expecting everything to be perfect, but knowing that you have the skills to make it better. And that skill of making it better is going to be much more effective if you do it in small steps. So this was actually mentioned by Ken and Beth this morning in the keynote, MMMSS. So we all know Jeepaw, who is fantastic. If you haven't come across Jeepaw, look him up. And this is one of his favorite phrases, MMMSS, many more, much smaller steps. And if you look him up, he's got loads of amazing, insightful things to say about how to do it and why it's effective. But the smaller the steps you move in, the smaller step from good to good. So you're moving from a state where everything is ready and working and the tests are passing to the same state where everything is working and the tests are passing. But you make those steps between states as small as possible. And that makes refactoring much easier. That makes it much easier to make things better because you just make something tiny better, something really small, and then you make another small thing better, and then another small thing better. And this is actually, I think, the most important thing that I'm going to say in the whole talk. It's really, really important, and it doesn't just apply to refactoring. It's really, really important that you do things in small steps because it makes such a difference. Okay, so how do you do this? How can you learn how to do things in small steps? Because actually, it's not easy. And it's not how most people work. It's not how most people do refactoring. Most people, when they refactor, they pull everything apart. They take the engine, they pull it into pieces, and they've got all the pieces lying on the floor in front of them. Not literally, it's an analogy. But they pull everything apart so that it doesn't work. While they're refactoring, they go through a period where the code doesn't even compile and the tests certainly don't pass. And this is really common, but it is not a good way to refactor. Because if you know that when you refactor this piece of code, you're going to be, for at least for some period of time, in a state where the code doesn't even compile, you're going to break everything, then that's very demotivating. That means you're much more likely to put it off because you know that while you're refactoring, the code's not going to work. You're not going to be able to deploy it. It's going to hold up all other development, so that puts you off. And it might mean that you do it in a branch, but you know that at some point, and in the branch, everything's falling apart and broken and can't deploy. But it also means you can't merge that code back into the rest of the code until it does work. And then you've spent so long on it that you're going to have broken everything when you try and merge it back in again. Particularly if you rename things or move things around, that's instant merge hell. And that's really common when you're refactoring, that you rename things and move things around. But renamed things are very difficult to merge. Renamed files are even harder to merge, and moved files are a nightmare. There are ways of doing this in tiny, tiny steps, where every single tiny step can be merged back into the main code base. And it's such a small step that the merge is easy and you don't break things. But it's a skill. So this is the Saman Technical Coaching Method. Spoiler, I am a member of the Saman Technical Coaching Society. Emily Bache, its founder, she lives here in Sweden. And she and I work together quite often. We teach people refactoring and test-driven development and pair programming and ensemble work. We also teach people how to do technical coaching. So the Saman Technical Coaching Society offers courses in helping people to become technical coaches. So one of the things that we encourage is for organizations to train people up within the organizations to become technical coaches. So it's not like we're saying you should always hire a technical coach and it should be us. We're saying you should have your own technical coaches and we can help them. We can help them. So all of the resources that the society produces are absolutely free. There's no copyright on any of it because we want people to use those resources. We want people to be technical coaches because we want people to improve their software practices. And one key practice is refactoring, and it isn't easy. You have to teach people. You have to teach people how to refactor in small steps and how to do it in such a way that it's not going to break anything and that you can do it in tiny little bits. So it doesn't have to be something that you keep putting off because it's this awful, big, horrible job. Details are on the QR code, but I highly recommend doing some technical coaching, getting people in, or having people within your organization who can train other people and help them to get better at things like refactoring. And of course, we saw Kent speak this morning, and Kent has actually got a foreword in Emily's book about technical coaching, and where he says, software development is best seen as a learning process, where running programs are the proof of learning rather than a factory or production process. And walking a new path together along with an experienced guide reduces the time spent not learning because of fear. And these skills like test-driven development and refactoring, they are skills and they don't often get taught in college. They're not often taught to software engineers, but they can make a real difference. And the best way of learning them is when you're taken on the journey by somebody who's experienced. So I talked before about self-belief and this idea that we don't refactor because we don't think we can, because we don't understand the code, but also just because we don't believe in ourselves. So I use this series of slides in quite a few different talks. I call this the Wheel of Confusion. That's me at the bottom with different hair. And this is when I was working at ThoughtWorks, and there is an internal message board where thousands of software developers talk about all topics under the sun. I put this slide together a few years ago, but on the day that I put it together, I just had a look at what people were talking about on that day that I didn't know about. So these were all topics that I didn't know about. And it's really tempting to look at all of these people talking about all of these topics and think, well, I don't know about any of those things. And look at all these people who are all talking about it so confidently. They all know more than me. They're all much better than me. But what it doesn't take account of is the fact that other people are looking at all of the other people and thinking they all know more than me. You know, I've only got one topic that I'm contributing confidently about, and everybody else is contributing to all of them. They all know more than me. So Andy's thinking the same thing, and so is Anik, and so is Ezra, and so is Georgia. If you're wondering where these pictures came from, I went to a social event when I was working at ThoughtWorks, and I went up to all my colleagues and I asked them to pose for photos looking confident and looking confused and upset and worried. So George is thinking the same thing. Ileana's thinking the same thing. John is. Kirsty is. Mircea is. Rob is. Scott is. And so am I. The thing is, everybody's worried. Everybody's worrying that other people know more than they do. It is okay to not understand a piece of code, but it's okay to want to understand a piece of code, and it's okay to make a piece of code easier to understand for your own benefit and for all of your colleagues' benefits and all of the people who come after you. And when you refactor in tiny steps, the obvious example is extracting one method. If you extract a few lines of code from inside one method to become a new method and you have good test coverage, you can be confident that you haven't broken anything. You've just made it easier to understand. Even if you still don't fully understand what the outside method is doing, you've taken one bit of it and made it easier to understand for you and for the people who come after you. And that's refactoring. And that can be done in a code base you don't understand. It can be done as part of making it easier to understand. Another thing that we can do is seek joy. So that's the last thing that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to suggest that we seek out the joy of coding, which is another thing that Kent and Beth spoke about this morning. The joy of coding, the joy of doing a good job. And this is Oscar again, and this time nobody got in his way. And he got to do his fancy tricks. And when we remove the blockers, then we can start to seek joy. And seeking joy is something that's easier to do when we're showing each other compassion and when we're showing ourselves compassion. And we're believing that it is possible to enjoy what you do. And it's possible to take satisfaction in what you do. And it's possible to take time to make our code great so that we really love it. If we show kindness and compassion to ourselves and each other, then we have more chance of acknowledging that software development can be fun, that it can be satisfying, that we can get a kick out of each tiny improvement and find ways of accessing, which is actually, this is another of Jeepaw Hill's phrase, it's geek joy. And we can all work on creating conditions where knowledge work is acknowledged and people don't feel like they need to ask permission to do a good job. They can take time to think and enjoy their work. Okay, so summary. Refactoring is making code easier to understand and cheaper to modify. It's best done continuously in tiny, low-risk steps. It's best done on code bases that are testable. It's less likely when you're working in an environment where there's not a lot of compassion, when you're working against unreasonable deadlines and unrealistically high standards, when you're feeling guilt or shame. But it's more likely when you're being shown compassion, when you're showing each other compassion and when you're showing yourselves compassion. It's more likely when you have more time, when you're able to work more slowly and really think about what you're doing. It's more likely if you embrace imperfection and don't think everything has to be perfect all the time. It's more likely when you focus on tiny improvements and go for that many more much smaller steps. It's more likely when we believe in ourselves and find ways of enjoying what we do. And that's Felix again, Oscar's big brother, finding joy in what he does. So he was 15 when we made this, and he is now 22, and he's a professional circus performer. And he does find joy in what he does. Okay, so there's a podcast called Making Tech Better. I hosted 27 episodes for a year. The episodes that are relevant to this talk are Emily, who I mentioned before. I interviewed her about refactoring. I interviewed Jeepaw Hill about test-driven development, Mary Williams about changing legacy systems, and Paula Poole about transformation. I think those topics are particularly relevant to refactoring. This is me. I offer technical coaching, group leadership coaching, keynotes, workshops. QR code will help you find me. I'm also available in all of those places. And I don't think we have time for questions. In fact, I've slightly run over. But thank you.